Hey, and welcome to the Deploying WordPress with Capistrano screencast. I'm Scott, one of the main Roots developers, and we're going to spend about 40 minutes improving how you deploy your WordPress sites. If you say a prayer or cross your fingers before a deploy, then this is a screencast for you. Deploying any codebase to production can be scary and a potentially dangerous operation, so anything we can do to eliminate risk is a good thing. There's a few things your deploys should always be: predictable, repeatable, automatable, reversible, and extensible. And that's where Capistrano comes in. Capistrano is a remote server automation and deployment tool written in Ruby. Capistrano became popular since it was the de facto way to deploy Ruby on Rails applications. It can be used to deploy any language, however. If you've previously written off Capistrano because it was too Rails specific, the good news is that it recently underwent a complete rewrite to version 3 to make it framework/language agnostic. We'll talk about this more later on. Let's jump right into a quick demo showing off Capistrano. I've already got a WordPress project set up, and I'm just going to do a basic deploy to a virtual machine that I already have running. The main benefit of Capistrano that you'll notice right away is one command deploys. So every Capistrano command always starts with its short form of cap. In this case, we need to specify the environment we're deploying to. Mine's just a test, so it's only development. And then finally, the deploy task. You might notice that I have bundle exec before this. That will be explained later on, but it is optional as well. So we're going to run this, and right away you'll see that Capistrano is going to output to your screen everything that's going on. We're not going to go too in-depth on everything that's happened right away, but you can quickly see that Capistrano outputs every single remote command that was actually executed on the server. The best way to understand what's actually happened during a Capistrano deploy is to look on the remote server that you deployed to. Mine's just a virtual machine, so I've already connected to it, and we're going to list out the directory that I'm deploying to. We'll go through the easy things right away. Revisions.log is simply a text file that contains a history of all your deploys. The repo directory is basically just a cached version of your Git repository that exists on the remote server. Shared is anything that's going to be shared between deploys. This is important for WordPress, for example, with user uploaded files. You need those shared between deploys so you don't lose them. Now, the heart of Capistrano is actually the releases directory. If we go in here and list it out, you can see that every deploy we've done corresponds to a folder that's named for its timestamp, so you can easily see when the deploy actually took place. Now let's go back, and the last thing left is a symlink called current. Current actually just points to one of the deploy directories under releases. In this case, the current symlink points to the release folder for the example deploy that I just did. If I ran that deploy again, the symlink would be updated to point to the new latest deploy. Although this folder structure is actually very simple, it's also quite powerful. The benefit that you get from a symlink that points to a specific release is that, first of all, if a deploy fails, the symlink is actually never updated to point to it. And second of all, since we have a history of our releases, you can easily roll back to any deploy just by changing the symlink to point to it. Now that we've seen Capistrano in action, let's talk a little bit more how it's written in Ruby and what that means to you. First of all, as I mentioned before, it can deploy any language, including PHP and WordPress specific applications, so we already have nothing to worry about. But that does mean in order to use Capistrano, that Ruby needs to be installed locally. That means you need Ruby and the Capistrano gem installed on the computer that you're running the commands from, not the remote server. That's because Capistrano is just executing commands over SSH. The other concern you might have is that Capistrano will be hard to use since you might not know Ruby. And Ruby is definitely pretty different from PHP. There's obviously a learning curve, but it's actually pretty simple for two reasons. The first is that Ruby is very readable to begin with, and quite simple. Number two, Capistrano version 3 actually uses rake. If you're familiar with grunt, which is a JavaScript task runner, rake is just a Ruby task runner, which leads into number 3. Ruby is well known for being great for DSLs or domain-specific languages. That's just a fancy term meaning when you actually write a rake task for Capistrano, it doesn't necessarily look like complex code. It's more declarative, and here's an example to show you what I mean. We'll get into the rest of this configuration file later on, but at the very bottom, we're actually defining a custom rake task. As you can see, it's actually quite readable. We're declaring a namespace called grunt, and a task under that namespace called theme. Then we're saying on roles app, which just means on our application server. Then we're doing within this release path, so that just means that within a folder, we're going to execute two commands. You can see the first one is npm install with some additional flags, and the second one is grunt with a custom task. Now I hope you'll agree with me that this isn't what you'd expect if I told you that you had to write your configuration files in a language that you didn't know. It is quite simple and readable. Also, I just realized I lied earlier. That was actually 3 reasons, not 2, why you shouldn't be too concerned that Capistrano is written in Ruby. Obviously, the first step before you can actually use Capistrano is to install it, and that means having Ruby and Ruby gems installed as well. The main dependency is that you need Ruby at least version 1.9. If you're not sure what version of Ruby you have, or even if you have it installed, just type ruby-v in your console, and for example, you can see that I'm running one of the latest versions, Ruby 2. And if you don't have Ruby installed, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly because this will return an error with command not found. The good news is OS X Mavericks actually ships with Ruby 2.0 now, and any semi-recent version of Ubuntu either comes with Ruby 1.9 or it's just one command away. The command might vary based on what version of Ubuntu you have, but since I already have a virtual machine running, we'll quickly give an example of installing 1.9.3. It's actually just apt-get install and the Ruby version. We won't run through this for now, so let's continue on. The only thing left to do now is actually install the Capistrano gem. Ruby gems are just their way of doing package management. If you're using the default system Ruby, you'll probably need to prefix the command with sudo. So just as an example, we do sudo gem install Capistrano, and we enter our password. You can see that when you install a gem, you're usually actually installing a lot of its dependencies as well. That's why you'll see other gems being installed. I should note that if you're actually following along with these commands, hopefully you actually didn't run that last one, because once we go through the Windows installation instructions, I'll actually show you a better way of managing your gems which doesn't require using sudo and installing them system-wide. For Windows, it definitely doesn't come with Ruby, so you're going to need to install it. Thankfully, there's actually a fairly friendly installer now. It's rubyinstaller.org. I suggest going with Ruby 2.0 as it's the latest. There's no need to pick an older one. And you'll probably also need to install the development kit as well. Just make sure you pick the correct one for the version of Ruby that you installed. The good news is that once that's installed, it's the exact same command to install the gem as we already saw, which is gem install Capistrano. As I mentioned earlier, there is a way to avoid using sudo to install gems such as Capistrano, and that's using bundler. Bundler just manages your application's gems by declaring them explicitly in a gem file. It's very similar to Composer with its composer.json file or npm with its packets.json file, if you're familiar with either of those. And since bundler itself is just a gem, we can see that you can install it with gem install bundler. Now you do need sudo to require this one because it will be installed first. But after that, any gems that you have in an application will no longer need sudo, as we'll soon see. I mentioned that when you use bundler, you actually declare all the gems that you want in a gem file. So let's take a look at an example gem file. It should always be found in the root of your project. In this example, we specify the default source of rubygems.org. That's standard. And next, we actually just list out all the gems that we want for application. Obviously, we want the base Capistrano gem and the latest version 3. And then in this example, we're also requiring some additional Capistrano extensions, such as Composer, npm, and grunt. Now, instead of manually typing out sudo gem install Capistrano and all the others that you need, you can just type bundle or in its long form, bundle install. Now that bundler is installed, we can go back to the command I first ran during the demo, which was bundle exec cap development deploy. Now, bundle exec is needed to prefix any Ruby command, such as cap in this case, if you are using bundler. Yes, it can be annoying and you might forget it at times, but if it is an issue, you could always just create a bash alias, such as cap, that actually just expands to bundle exec cap. Hopefully that wasn't too difficult to get set up. The one downside to Capistrano is probably the Ruby dependency. Ruby, and specifically its gems, are a little notorious for being difficult to install, but hopefully once you have that installed, you shouldn't have any issues. The good news is that there's tons of resources online. Just Google if you have any issues with this, because lots of people have gone through it before. Now that we have Ruby and Bundler ready to go, we can finally start using Capistrano. I'm just going to duplicate the gem file setup to actually get Capistrano installed once again, just so you can see what it's like to get going from scratch on a project. So going by the Bundler website again, for example, we can copy this text and create a gem file. We'll add in the default source, and in this case, we only want the Capistrano gem. Now we'll run bundle to install all of the gems in our gem file, and that's it. Capistrano comes with an install command which creates all the necessary files for you. So let's run cap install. Remember to prefix it if you're using bundler with bundle exec cap install. Capistrano thankfully tells us exactly what it's done. It's created the config deploy directory. It's created the deploy.rb, some specific environment configs. In this case, the default stages are staging and production. And it's created a lib Capistrano tasks folder as well. And it said it's capified. To confirm what it's done, we'll run a git status. We can see the new files it's created are a cap file. The gem files were created by me, and the config deploy directory. Let's run through all the files and directories that Capistrano created quickly, and just give a quick explanation of them. The first one is the cap file. It is basically the entry point for Capistrano. Its main purpose is just to require extensions and load tasks. This is the default stuff that you should leave in here, including Capistrano setup, Capistrano deploy. You can see that some extra extensions are commented out. In this case, all of these are actually Rails specific, so we could easily just get rid of this commented out code. And the very last one loads custom tasks from lib Capistrano tasks, if you have any defined. We don't right now, and it's up to you what folder structure you actually put these in. Just to keep it simple, let's delete this for now. We'll save this file. We're also going to delete the lib folder. Next up is the config directory. If we go in there, we can see that the main deployment configuration is deploy.rb. .rb means it's a Ruby file. There's some settings right away, such as application name, repo URL, and there's a lot of things commented out. We'll get to these soon as well, and there's also a few tasks down here. The next directory is actually the deploy directory, and by default it contains a production and staging config. These are just environment specific configs that kind of override or add additional settings to the main deploy.rb file. And that's it. The next thing we're going to do is actually just explore all the default tasks that Capistrano has enabled for us. And we'll type bundle exec cap -t, just dumps out all the tasks. As you can see, almost all of the default tasks start with deploy. If you ever see a colon in a task name, this is just the deploy namespace, and then this is the more specific task. And then at the very bottom, there's cap install, which you'll generally only use at the very beginning of your project. There's not too much of a point in running through all these now, so I'll explain the important ones as we come across them. Now we're actually going to start setting up our configuration for deploying a WordPress site. Let's start by opening up the default deploy.rb file. First up, application. Well, that's whatever your name is, but in this case, we'll change it to roots.io. Set repo URL. Obviously, this assumes that the application that you're deploying is hosted as a Git repository. In our case, it's on GitHub as a private repository, so I'm just gonna update this. Next up, it says ask branch. This is one of the more complicated code things in Capistrano because it has this proc keyword. Basically, if you use ask instead of set, it's actually going to prompt you for it. In our case, we don't actually need to ask for a branch. It should really just assume whatever one you're on, or to make it really easy, you could just do set branch master. As you're going through this, you'll probably also want to refer to the documentation. There's the official Capistrano website with quite a few getting started articles. And then there's also the official Git repository, which has a slightly useful README. Let's keep going through the rest of our deploy.rb file to clean it up and set the variables that we actually need. So we did set our branch as master. That's actually the default, so we can get rid of that. But in my opinion, sometimes it is better to automatically deploy the branch that you're currently on. So if we change this ask to set and leave it as is, it's actually going to run this git command, which just determines the current branch that you're on. One of the most important settings in here is the deploy to. That's where you're actually going to deploy your application on the remote server. In my case, on my virtual machine, it's srv www and roots.io. Next up is set scm git. That's what kind of source control you're using. Git's the default, and that's what we are using, so we can delete that. Next up is format pretty, and that is the format of the output. In this case, it's the default, and yes, we want it to look nice, so we'll also get rid of that. The default log level is debug. It's probably a little too verbose unless you really want to understand what's going on or you're trying to fix an issue. So by default, we'll set it to info. Next up, PTY. We can set this for now. We're going to skip down a bit to default env. That's a default environment. In this case, you can see that they're setting a path to be executed. And this will be set for every single command that gets executed on the remote host. If you don't know what this means, then you probably don't need to set it. But for example, if you wanted to change some locations of where PHP libraries were, you could change this to something as example user local bin. But again, by default, it's actually just an empty object, so we're going to delete that. Keep releases. That's the number of releases that you'll keep in that releases directory that I showed before. 5 is the default. It's a decent number. If you want a bigger history, increase that number. I doubt you'd probably ever want to set it to less than 5. Maybe the only reason be if your application was really big and you had limited disk space for some reason. But again, 5 is the default, so we'll just delete this. Next up are two important settings called linked files and linked DIRs. Just keep in mind that the default settings here that are commented out are Rails specific, so we're obviously going to want to change these. Linked files means they're files that are going to be shared across releases, and as you can probably guess, linked DIRs are directories that are going to be shared across deploys or releases. The way that linked files and linked directories actually work is that they're kept under the shared folder, and then during each deploy, they're then symlinked into a release directory. The most common use case for either of these settings is linked DIRs. To begin with, you'll probably, at a minimum, need to add your uploads directory for WordPress. In the default case of Roots, it's actually called media. So we'll get rid of linked files for now because we don't have any, and we'll actually just change our linked DIRs to just be media. If you're wondering what this little %w curly brace means, it's just a nicer way of making an array in Ruby. Another way of writing this would be the standard square brackets, which you might be used to in PHP as well, and quoting the string that you want, in this case media. Just to visualize what's going on here with the linked DIRs, let's take a look on my example virtual machine to see what it actually looks like. First, we'll just clear up this extra line. Now we'll list out this directory, and you'll remember that there's the current symlink, the releases directory, and here's a shared one we're interested in. So if we go into the shared directory, there's a few other things here that we'll ignore for now, but the key one is media. Again, that's where our WordPress uploads are going. And if we go back into current, we can see that media is actually a symlink to shared media, and that's exactly what we want. Let's head back to our deploy.rb configuration file and talk about some rake tasks. As I mentioned before, Capistrano version 3 is built on top of rake, which just stands for Ruby make. It's just a Ruby task runner. By default, they've included 2 tasks in your deploy.rb file. So these are rake tasks. You can see that there's a namespace called deploy. This namespace already exists in Capistrano by default, and then they're defining 2 custom tasks, one called restart and another event, which we'll get to in a bit. First, let's just delete this one so we can focus on the restart task. The restart task is actually required by Capistrano. A deploy will fail if it doesn't exist. Note that in this case, although it exists, it's not actually doing anything, and that's entirely okay. So let's delete these commented out lines. We're also going to delete these extra options which apply if you have more than one server. We're just going to assume that you're only deploying to a single server for now. So we'll get rid of that. And in the WordPress world, you're probably either going to restart either Apache or Nginx when you're deploying, depending on maybe if you have a caching system or not. So we're going to write out execute Apache 2 CTL, comma, and graceful. One important thing to know about the execute command in Capistrano is to always comma separate all your arguments for a command. For example, you wouldn't want to write this out as a single string. Even if you were adding a third argument, such as a flag, you'd add another comma, and then a string, for example, maybe -v, if that even exists for Apache Graceful. And these colons before a word in Ruby are just a keyword. We're actually just going to change these to be strings, just to be consistent. It should be noted that the kind of task you see here, for example, a task on a certain server and execute a command, that's probably going to be the most common type of task you have in Capistrano. They generally won't get too much more difficult than that. So that's another reason to not be too concerned if you don't know some complex rake commands or Ruby itself. This execute command gives us a good opportunity to also talk about users and permissions. Since we're just executing commands over SSH, you obviously need to have permission to run this command, Apache 2 CTL, for example, by the user that Capistrano is connecting as. One way of changing the user is right before this, we can add an extra block called as. Maybe we have a user called deploy, do, and we wrap the execute command underneath that. Often you'll also need to prefix a command with sudo. There's a quick shortcut to do that in Capistrano. Instead of using a specific user, we'll get rid of that, and we'll actually just change execute to sudo. What that does is it just runs the execute command with sudo before it. Now in my virtual machine case, just to be accurate, I'm actually using a Nginx. So as another example, we'll do actually in Ubuntu, there's a quick way to restart services by doing service. Once again, we're going to comma separate these, Nginx, another comma, and reload, which is better than restart. Believe it or not, this is actually all that's required in this main configuration file to do a WordPress deploy. All we're doing is pulling down a Git repository and setting up the uploads directory to be linked, and we're also including a restart of the web server. Now, there is another step to do, and for that, we're going to look into the environment-specific configuration files. So if we, in the config deploy directory, the 2 default ones were production and staging. We'll take a look at staging first, for example. You can see right away that we're manually setting the stage to staging. Right below that is roles. The roles are actually just the servers that you're deploying to. Usually for a simple WordPress server, all of your roles are the same one. You're probably running Nginx with obviously PHP and WordPress, and maybe even MySQL for the database all in the same server. So one way is to explicitly list each one out like this. A probably better way to get started is the extended down below, so we can do everything on one line. So we're going to get rid of that. Under server, in my case, it's just a roots.dev host, and the user, since it's a Vagrant virtual machine, as I'm going to type in Vagrant, it takes on the roles of web app and DB. And this is just an example, an extra property. We don't need that, so we can get rid of it. The other main thing that an environment or stage-specific configuration file is used for is setting the SSH options, which controls how you're actually going to connect to the server. For example, you might connect with the default password, you might connect with a SSH key, or you might use a forward agent as well. We can do that all below. There's some extensive comments here, and once again, if you're only using one server, we can just go with the global options. There's a way to define it per server as well, but we're just going to get rid of that for now and keep it simple. So we'll uncomment this, and they have some options in here as well, such as keys, forward agent, and auth methods. For example, if you're connecting to a Vagrant virtual machine, you can actually get rid of these two and just set the key. In this case, since I'm using Vagrant, this is how you can actually connect with the Vagrant private key. It's obviously going to be different in your case if you're not using Vagrant. Unfortunately, setting up your server in terms of SSH options, or even at a lower level such as getting your application set up or installing Node or Grunt, is beyond the scope of this screencast, but it is really important to make sure that you can easily connect to your server. The best way to do it is via SSH key, so you're not always entering your password. Fortunately, the official Capistrano website has a great guide called Authentication and Authorization. It goes through every single step of how you can get an SSH key authentication working and how it integrates with Capistrano as well. So I highly suggest that you take the time and read through this article, and it will make your deploys a lot easier. Finally, it's time for our initial deploy, and we're going to see what happens. So bundle exec, in this example we were just using staging, so we're going to do staging deploy, and we're going to take a look at the output and what actually happens. And we have an error. If we look up the stack trace, we can see that the last command that was successfully run, or the last command that was attempted to run, we were trying to make the directory, the shared directory and the releases directory. The problem here is that we are running this deploy as the Vagrant user. We need to make sure that the permissions on your remote server allow the Vagrant user to create, read, and write directories. There's nothing magical going on. It's the same thing as if you just SSH'd into the server as the Vagrant user and didn't have permissions to do that. So we're going to take a look at our directory, and we can see that it's actually owned by root. So we'll change the owner to Vagrant and www.data. We'll also just do this recursively. I don't think there's anything in there right now. Oh, we also need to specify the folder, so we'll change roots.io. Now if we list this again, it's now owned by Vagrant. So we'll go back here and rerun our deploy command. Since this is the first time that we're running this deploy successfully, you can see that it's actually setting up its default folder structure with shared and releases, as well as the media folder which we set in linked dirs. Next thing it's doing is actually cloning the repository into the repo directory. This will take a while, so we're going to skip ahead. Finally, we see that the releases directory was created, and the next major thing that happens is we symlink this media directory in shared into the specific release, and then once the deploy is actually successful, the final step is deleting the old current symlink if it exists, and creating the new one to point to the latest deploy. Finally, you see that our nginx reload command was also run. Going back to the start of the screencast, I said there's 5 things your deploy should always be: predictable, repeatable, automatable, reversible, and extensible. Obviously, everything we've been doing up to this point has been automatable since we're using an automated tool and we're explicitly coding what we want to happen. It's easily repeatable as well. You can see that we can do another deploy and it will be much faster than the first one because we've already pulled down the repo and created the initial folders. Next up is reversible. One of the best commands in Capistrano is simply typing bundle exec cap. We need to always remember to include the stage or environment, so staging, and then we do deploy : rollback. Two things happened of note here. The first is that it actually created an archive called rollback release with the date timestamp as well. The second is at the very bottom, we can see that we rolled back to the specific release timestamp. Now, if we take a look on our remote server, in the deploy to directory, you can actually see the rollback release was archived as well. Although you've probably already seen how Capistrano deploys can be predictable, before we explain that more in depth, let's go back to our configuration files and take a look at the other default stage that's included, which is production. First of all, if we go back to our staging one, we can see that we simplified it and cleaned it up. So let's do the same thing for production. Now, your IP or host of your production server is hopefully different. So for example, maybe it's just roots.io in our case instead of roots.dev. And your user might be deploy. Once again, the roles may all be included on the same server. So we're going to add DB, clear this out. And if we look back to the SSH options, you may have different ones for your production server. So you could also change it in here. Maybe you're using a forward agent, which if you're familiar, is an agent that you can run on your local server to forward connections through SSH keys. These stage-specific configuration files, such as staging or production, serve two purposes, as I mentioned before. The first is setting specific settings, such as a server or SSH option, and the other is either additional configuration or even overwriting configuration from the main deploy.rb. For example, we had set up our log level to be the default info. If we wanted a different log level on production, we could just overwrite it in here and it will take precedence. You may have noticed the last line that's been commented out in these files by default. It's actually setting a default env or environment. Some people use environment variables to specify various configuration options, maybe like a global WordPress environment. So in this case, they have a Rails env example for it could be a WP env, and it usually corresponds to the stage you're in. So in this case, they're both production. And if we go back to staging, we'll also change this to WP env. Keep in mind, this is completely optional. You may not use this, so feel free to delete it as well. Before moving on from these files, we have to go over what's actually absolutely necessary. We can get rid of this log level debug since that was just an example. By default, the stages are already included, so let's leave that. We obviously need a server defined or roles if you have different ones, and you'll most likely need to define your own SSH options since everyone connects to servers differently. At a bare minimum, this is what should be in your stage files. As we've already seen from our example deploy, this is actually all that's needed to do a successful WordPress deploy. Before we move on to some more advanced stuff, let's do a quick recap of all the files that we had to modify. We had our main cap file. All we're doing is keeping the defaults of including the Capistrano setup and the Capistrano deploy tasks. Next up was our main config deploy RB file. We set the application name, we set our repo URL, we set some default branch information, we set our deploy to folder, and we set up our WordPress upload folder in linked dirs, and we also defined how we're actually restarting our application. Keep in mind that a web server restart is actually optional here, but remember that you do need the restart task. Next, we have some stage-specific config files such as staging and production, and at a minimum, you need a server defined and how you're connecting to it. And that's it. Now it's time to get into the good stuff, and that's how Capistrano is predictable and extensible. Now we're going to talk about Capistrano's deployment flow. There's a great article on their homepage, in the sidebar here, called Flow. And you can see that Capistrano version 3 provides a default deploy flow and a separate rollback flow. Now when you actually run the deploy tasks, the following tasks are run in sequence. Deploy starting, deploy started, deploy updating, deploy updated. You're probably seeing a pattern here. There's publishing, published, finishing, and finished. Now the great thing about Capistrano is each of these past tense ones, like started, updated, published, and finished, are actually called hooks. Now you can actually hook custom tasks into that flow by using before or after. So you could say after deploy started, run this task, or before deploy finished, run this task. As WordPress developers, you might find some similarities here to the actual hooks or actions in WordPress. Just as in WordPress where you can add an action to kind of hook into a WordPress request lifecycle event and enhance it, you can do the exact same thing in Capistrano, and that's where all of its power comes from. The best way to understand hooks is to create one ourselves and do a deploy. So let's head back to our main deploy.rb configuration file. We're just going to add another temporary namespace and task right in here. So we'll just create one called routes and a task. Let's just call it debug because all we're going to do is output a message. And we just want it to run on any role, so we're going to do all. And we're just going to use the info function. All it does is output a message to your console during the deploy at the info log level. So we're just going to write routes. And that's all that it is for the task. Now we need to add the hook. We're going to do it after the deploy has started. So we're going to write after deploy started and the full task name, including the namespace routes and the task itself. So we'll save that file and then we'll write out bundle exec cap staging deploy, and we're going to look for our message. And there it is right there, info routes. This was a fairly trivial example, so let's talk about some actual use cases where you would need to use hooks. So let's go back into our configuration file again. The first use case that we're going to go over is using Composer. If you've seen my other screencast about using Composer to manage WordPress or read some of the blog posts, you might be familiar with this. The idea behind this is that when you do a deploy, you actually need to run an additional command, which is just composer install. That means that if someone had updated your dependencies, say to bump the WordPress version or add a new plugin, you'll need to run composer install on that deploy so that it's actually updated. It's actually pretty simple. Again, let's leave it at, actually let's change the namespace to composer. And the task is just going to be install. We can add an optional description in here that says install composer dependencies. We only want this to be run on the app server, so we'll change the roles to be app. We'll get rid of this, and the only thing we actually need to do is execute the composer install command. So just like you saw before, we'll run execute, just keep these as strings, and we'll say composer install. And I have some extra flags that we'll pass in as well. And that's it. Now that the task is complete, we have to update our hook to run it at the correct time. We don't want it to run after deploy started, so we're going to change this to be before. And looking back at the flow, we can see that there's deploy updating. It says update servers with a new release, and updated means that it has been updated. So that's when we actually want to run composer install. We want to run it before it's published or finished, because if there's an error with the composer install command, we want that to roll back. So we're going to change this to be before deploy updated, and let's just add our new task, composer install. So let's run this and see what happens. and we can see that we actually got an error. So if we go back up, right away we can see that the composer install was the problem, and during the execute command. If we scroll up, that was the last thing that was run. Now sometimes you can't tell exactly what the issue was just with the log level at info. So if we go back in our config and change that to debug, and we'll actually rerun our deploy to get some more information, see if we can figure out what's going on. So if we scroll back up, you can see that when we're actually running the composer install command, we're not in a directory. That's definitely a problem. You can see, for example, in a command up here, it changes directory into something. So that's what we need to add to our task. We need to say within, and the magic variable that Capistrano exposes to you is actually just called release path. So it's release underscore path do. What that means is that if you remember our folder structure with releases, it's actually going to go into the latest release that it's in the middle of deploying. So let's save that. Actually, we'll just change the log level back to info and deploy once more. Now you can see that it successfully ran the composer install command since we were in the correct directory. One of the other things you might want to do during your deploy is, if you're familiar with roots again, is using grunt. Grunt is the JavaScript task runner, so say you need to compile less or Sass into CSS, or if you need to concatenate or minify your JavaScript files, you can make that part of your deployment process just like we do with Composer. So if we go back into our config file, we're going to create another namespace with another task. We'll actually just copy this one because a lot of it is the same boilerplate. So we'll say namespace grunt, and we'll say run grunt task, and we'll change the task name from install to, let's mirror the actual grunt task that you're running. Let's say maybe it's deploy. So we're still going to keep this on the app, and we're still going to keep it within the release path, but we're going to update this to be grunt, and whatever task you're actually running, if it's called deploy, then we'll leave it at that. Now to add an additional hook, we can just duplicate this line and say grunt deploy. At this point, we're getting into slightly more complicated rake tasks within Capistrano. For instance, this grunt task isn't actually complete. If you are using grunt, it actually uses npm. So before you know that grunt's even there, you'd actually need to execute npm install. There's probably some additional flags you'd want to write as well, like maybe quiet or dash production. These are off the top of my head. But the point is you're going to be duplicating a lot of effort that other people might also be doing. Now is the point where we're going to get into extending Capistrano with existing plugins, which happen to be Ruby gems. We still want to run Composer and Grunt, but we're going to delete all of these for now and look at some existing gems that duplicate this behavior and make it easier on us. So we'll delete these and save it. The next thing to do is we're going to update our gem file. If you remember, the gem file is where we specify all the gems that we want to use in our project. I already happen to know the names of these, so let's add some new gems. The first one is Capistrano Composer. I don't know the version off the top of my head, and it is optional, so let's leave it off. It'll just pull down the latest one. The next one is Capistrano NPM, and finally Capistrano Grunt. To install them, we just have to type in bundle. It's going to be quick for me because they're already in my cache. It might take longer for you if you haven't installed them yet. If you're wondering where you can find out about a lot of these Capistrano gems or extensions, obviously you can Google for them. You'll probably find pages themselves or maybe answers in Stack Overflow. Another source is the actual Capistrano organization on GitHub. They host a lot of, let's say, official ones. For example, there's a lot of Ruby specific ones, as you can see, RBNV, Bundler, RVM. There's actually a PHP framework called Laravel. And if we keep going down, we can actually see the Capistrano, Composer, and NPM ones. These were actually contributed by myself and some other people as well. And under the roots one, we have a Capistrano Grunt, which was also updated to version 3. Keep in mind that if you do find some Capistrano gems, to make sure that they've been updated to be version 3 compatible. Any ones that aren't will definitely not work. Most Capistrano extensions have a README which detail how they're used. For example, in Capistrano Grunt, it tells you how to install it by what you need to add to your gem file. And it also tells you how you add it to your cap file. And under usage, they usually involve setting some optional variables since there's usually defaults. And then they actually tell you the task if you want to run it on your own or where you can hook into it. So let's check out the official Capistrano Composer one and find out how to use that, and we're going to add it into our project. So we've already installed it. The next thing we need to do is require it in our gem file, or our cap file actually. So we're going to open our cap file, and under this, we'll just put a comment. Let's just say custom tasks, and we'll add that right in there. We can see that the Composer gem comes with a bunch of tasks. For now, we only care about Composer install, and you can run it on your own if you want. The good news is that if we have a default Composer set up and we want to use the standard flags that they set and the location of Composer, which is just the Composer command itself globally, that we actually don't have to do anything other than requiring it, which we've already done. So let's run a deploy and make sure that Capistrano is actually running Composer install at the correct time. And here it is. We can see that Composer install was successfully run, and all we had to do was require that task in our cap file. Now let's turn our attention to getting npm and grunt working. We already installed the gems, so once more we have to go into our cap file, and we need to require npm and grunt as well. It's always important to look up the documentation for how these extensions work. So we're going to go to the official npm gem. We can see that first of all we need to require it, which we just did. The important part is that the task is going to run before deploy updated as part of the default deploy. So that means that we don't have to add the hook ourselves. The thing we do have to do is look at this additional configuration option called npm target path. By default, npm install is just going to run in the root of the release path. But if you're familiar with how Roots uses grunt, it's actually going to be in your theme, not in the root of your project. So what we're going to have to do is update the target path to point to the theme. That means that we need to edit our deploy.rb file, and we're just going to copy this option. So set npm target path, and what we want to do is put it in the theme path. Everything's always based off of the release path. We've already seen that that variable is provided by Capistrano. So the default would just be release path itself. So what we need to do is, there's a few ways. One is we can open a string in Ruby and use string interpolation to add a release path. We're going to add a slash. And on my virtual machine, I'm actually using the composer method that I showed in my last screen path. So the roots theme path is actually app themes roots. So we're going to write that out in here. And we'll finish that off. And that's all we need to do for npm install. So to make sure this works, we'll save that and we'll run another deploy. Here's the composer install once again. And now we can see that npm install is being run. This will probably take a bit, so we'll skip ahead. And the deploy completed successfully. The last thing we need to take care of is running grunt. We already added it in our cap file, so it's there. And we need to look up the documentation of this gem to see how it works. So it's actually under roots. The grunt gem is actually slightly different. We still need to require it, but it's actually not going to be run automatically like Composer and npm was. The first thing we need to do is set the grunt tasks. In our case, Roots actually just uses the default one. So if you don't set this, it's going to act like it's running grunt default anyway, so we can leave that out. And the next thing is we need to manually add the hook in ourselves. So let's go back in our deploy.rb file, and at the bottom we'll add in before deploy updated. And there's one, again, just like the npm target path, we need to base the grunt target path in the exact same file. So we're going to copy this, and what we could do is we could duplicate this exact same setting and type it in here. But this is a good opportunity to just set another custom variable. It won't be used by anything else in Capistrano other than ourselves. So we're just going to call it theme path. Any option in Capistrano that you use set for, there's actually a specific way of reading that option. And it's just the simple fetch keyword. So we're going to do fetch theme path, and then we're going to do the exact same thing here. So now they're both set to the exact same path, and we're going to do another deploy and see if it works. I'm just going to skip ahead to the end to save some time. You can see that the grunt command completed successfully. Now that we've done this, we've demonstrated a automatable and repeatable single command deploy that we've extended with 3 separate gems. We run composer install, we run an npm, and we also run a grunt task. If any of these fail, the deploy will actually abort in the middle and it won't be deployed, meaning the symlink called current won't be pointed to that release, since the release will just be deleted. We've also seen how easily Capistrano can reverse deploys just by issuing a single rollback command. And thanks to Capistrano's consistent deployment flow, every deploy you run is predictable since everything's going to happen in the exact same order. I hope this has inspired you to take a look at Capistrano and hopefully integrate it into your WordPress, not only development, but obviously deployment workflow, and really take a look at what hooks you can use to extend your deployment process by automating every single action that you need to take during a deploy. Thanks for buying and watching the screencast. If you need any additional help or have questions or suggestions, don't hesitate to post on the Roots forums. Other members will probably help you out, and I will as well.